Good evening. We'll start now. Your Savannah Council on World Affairs is pleased on this Earth Day 2021 to bring you a presentation entitled People, Food, and Nature, What We Do to the Earth and What It Does Back to Us, presented by Lisa Palmer. I'm Chip O'Brien, a board member of the Savannah Council, and in the absence of our program chair, Jim Van Epps, who could not make it tonight, I will have the pleasure of introducing Lisa in a few moments and handling questions from the audience after her talk is completed. But first, as our normal tradition is, I wanted to thank our sponsors who, together with our member dues, enable us to bring you these programs. I'm going to screen share a couple of things, if it works, just a second. So our platinum sponsor, as you are probably aware, for each program this year is Kreitz Automotive, who are the Savannah dealer for Buick, GMC, BMW, Mercedes-Benz, and Sprinter vans. Our silver sponsor for this presentation is Chase Bank, who offer you a broad range of financial services from multiple locations in Savannah, including on Skidaway Island. We welcome Chase as a new member of Savannah Council World Affairs sponsorship group. Lastly, we thank Daily Chatter, a nonpartisan, objective international email newsletter, which the council provides free to all members who request a subscription. If you haven't gotten your free subscription just yet, please drop us a line at savannahcwa@gmail.com. This same offer is for any university enrolled student, so just let us know and we'll make sure they get an invitation to subscribe free. Lisa Palmer is a career journalist and the National Geographic Visiting Professor of Science Communication at the School of Media and Public Affairs at the George Washington University. She regularly documents the innovations of people and organizations who work on solutions to mitigating climate change, biodiversity loss, and global hunger. Her recent book, Hot, Hungry Planet: The Fight to Stop a Global Food Crisis in the Face of Climate Change, presents 7 case studies from every corner of the globe where efforts are underway to develop a new or several new methods to feed a growing population. Lisa is published in many scientific journals around the world and has traveled widely abroad. She has a Master's of Science degree from Simmons College in Boston and graduated from Boston University with a Bachelor of Science degree. It is particularly fitting that Lisa is presenting to the Savannah Council today, the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. Please address your questions to our speaker by using the Q&A button, either at the bottom or the top on your Zoom screen, and I will pass along those questions to Lisa at the end of her prepared remarks. Now I'm going to turn it over to Lisa.
Thank you, Chip. I really appreciate your introduction. I'm going to start sharing my screen. But before I do share the screen, I just wanted to say that tonight, we'll talk about my book and about how people, food, and nature kind of must work together to be able to handle this hotter, wetter, more variable planet we're living on. And so I'll be getting into that, but also I'll be covering a further array of reporting that I'm doing and some of the new stories that I'm writing on, as well as what I covered in my book. So here's my share screen. And so I'll be talking to you about some of my work that I have on my PowerPoint. I just have some videos or some images here that will help to illustrate what I'm talking about. And after I'm finished with my prepared remarks, I would welcome a wider conversation, because I think that usually the questions that you all have are way more interesting than whatever prepared remarks that I have. So this will be just some starting points and some talking points for us. And as you may know, as I begin to share some of my stories, my work in reporting of people around the world, you might see me getting really inspired and enthusiastic. That's because that where I really get a lot of my energy is when I'm able to get out into the field and to talk to people, as well as to talk to people like you, this group and I've talked to other World Affairs Councils throughout the United States. And actually, I'm currently in Santa Fe, and I just looked up to see if they have a World Affairs Council here, because I'm thinking about moving here at some point in the future. So, I find it really heartening to know that so many people are interested in kind of what's happening around the world, and knowing that we're not so disconnected from world events, as we can even see with this pandemic, how quickly something travels around our very connected world. So I'm going to, hopefully you can, I'm looking here at advancing my slides. So one second. There we go. So, I have three different areas that I'll be speaking with today. One is just sort of in general, how people, food, and nature are related. I'll talk a bit about my book, and then I'll kind of talk about some of these hopeful points for the future. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with this slide. I always like to point out that it's probably one of the best data storytelling methods I've ever seen. But it's the record of our temperature record from the past 100 years globally. So it's called the warming stripes, and it basically represents what has, in a visual form, what has been our average change in annual temperature. And it's one of the methods that I use when I'm talking with my students, is that we can write stories, we can show them visually in a single image. But all around us, we're being able to look at and see how our world is changing almost on a daily basis with new ideas and information that come across. I just pulled up your area from I guess it was a recent report in Climate Central regarding the land projected to be below annual flood level in 2050. So quite a bit of the surrounding areas that surround Savannah will potentially be underwater more often than not during these annual floods. So, we can see these headlines that happen around the world of things happening. And as I'm out in the field, I'm documenting them. We read about the rising temperatures or the rising sea levels, and that really shows us some of these tipping points. And these headlines that come up all the time, it kind of brings us dread. We hear about the melting ice. Is the Western Antarctic ice shelf going to collapse? How much will that add to rising seas? And then we read headlines about the burning forests, and is there going to be a wildfire season this year, or is it going to be wildfire kind of annually and ongoing basis, which is what we've been seeing in our has really changed in the last 10 years or so. These kinds of headlines are the planet's somewhat darkest and most frightening headlines, and they're I think that's I guess they're the types of headlines that really show us that we're kind of at this tipping point. But we're seeing, I think, right now with kind of the new movement in this administration, with a new movement towards more action from young people and people that are becoming more solutions focused on the issue of the environment and climate change, that we have this other tipping point, which I think is a promise of hope. It could be just as abrupt and irreversible as the crisis that propels it. So, I think that this happens on this new scale where we have to look at how we can address the environment on a much more committed basis, using everything from the environmental justice lens, food security lens, inclusion, and corporate sustainability lens, and solutions of how we are going to slow our changing climate. So, today I'm going to talk about the I guess, a range of issues that people are feeling around the world, what the food we eat, and the nature we rely on for our health. I first wanted to start by taking you into the field. This is one of the pictures of me on a sweaty reporting trip, taking notes, and I'm meeting and talking with people around the world. And that's really where I get my inspiration, is when I can get out into the field. You know, I do spend a lot of time desk reporting. I'll spend, you know, months gathering information, doing some pre-interviews, talking to researchers who've been in the field so I can help to map out where I'll go, especially, and find some of the more important things to report on. And so I wanted to talk with you start by reading one of the passages from a recent reporting trip. This happened to be a reporting trip I took to Peru. It was one of the last trips out of the country I took before the pandemic kind of shut everything down. I guess it was the before times, or the precedented times we always, you know, talk about now these days. So I want to just read a short passage to you. This is a story that was published regarding a new way of looking at conservation technology. So I'm going to start reading what I wrote in this story. Percy Avalo sits at the bow of the canoe, pointing to floating logs and other hazards as Davis Vargas steers the Peki Peki, a tiny motor adapted to negotiate the shallows of this meandering lowland river that borders one side of the nearly 300-mile perimeter of this vast conservation concession. I departed in the fog at dawn to join Vargas and Avalos on their weekly river patrol, leaving from the shore of the tropical Los Amigos Biological Station and concession that buffers the eastern side of Mono National Park, considered by many to be one of the single most biologically important protected areas in Latin America. And then I went on to explain, you know, that the patrol of this area isn't a simple mission either. I mean, this tiny boat, 300 square miles of this perimeter. And so I wrote, while this strategically located patchwork of protected areas has been mostly successful in its conservation goals so far, deforestation and devastation within the rest of the Madre de Dios de Mana region is at an all-time high. And so in truth, the tropical lushness I found along the Los Amigos River, home to capybara babies and white caimans and red howler monkeys, in some places lies within easy earshot of the gold miners' pumps and loggers' chainsaw. And so, you know, how did I get to writing that? This took quite a bit of reporting to get this far. But, you know, on the banks of this river, I took, maybe a 5 or 6 hour journey from the nearest town, which is a town called Labyrinto. And it was, you know, the town is filled with dirt streets and shops for selling all the equipment that you need for equipping a gold mining rig, which is what you see here in this image. And then they had food markets, stalls selling Fruit Loops, you know, bags of Fruit Loops that you eat for breakfast alongside coca leaves, I guess, for energy. After I got to Labyrinto, I got into this canoe and went up the river to the biological station. But, you know, this area is roughly about 30 miles from the Bolivian border. And so you can, and it's sort of in the southeastern region of Peru and along the Amazon rainforest. And so, you know, by the time I climbed out of that canoe, I had passed hundreds and hundreds of illegal gold mines, just like what you see here, that were in plain sight. The tropical sun was overhead, you know, sweat's pouring down on everybody. And, you know, we think of all of the different pressures that are hitting the tropical areas around the world. We hear about the deforestation in Brazil, where I guess, you know, people are cutting down lots of trees to create cattle ranches or places to grow soybeans, even though it's illegal and it's not supposed to be done. Same thing here. You know, these are illegal artisanal gold mines that are not supposed to be there, but they're happening in plain sight. And so, you know, so I went to this area to report on. This is the canoe I went up this big river in for several hours. We were strapped in. So I went to Los Amigos to report on the conservation technologists from Latin America and around the world who are working with Peruvian NGOs and government agencies and researchers to understand how precision technologies might help to create this early warning system. And, and a level of transparency to limit the gold mining and illegal logging that's there. So they were deploying everything from like acoustic monitoring devices to listen for chainsaws or gunshots, far in the distance. This is also an area where there are uncontacted people and that wish to remain so. And so they're really trying to keep out any kind of pressure on these rural areas for any kind of development in that way. So that, there's a variety of technologies that people are actually bringing to this area to help find a solution. And so the reason I'm bringing this in there, even though I didn't necessarily write about this in my book, is that people are finding innovative ways to come together and find solutions, where we have technology companies that have really never considered themselves as maybe environmentalists or conservationists. They're using this technology in a completely new way that we would have never expected, using artificial intelligence, precision technologies to be able to understand what will be at risks and how to predict it and approach it. So, I approach these stories to show the reader that, how these new groups of people and entrepreneurs, engineers, computer scientists, and anthropologists are really working together to bring people into focus. And it's a common thread in much of the work and writing that I do and the reporting that I do and have done over the last maybe 10 to 15 years as a reporter. I really try to find the people who are looking or who are maybe making collaborations or working together for the first time. I want to talk to people who might be trying something new, even though they're 70 years old and have done it the same way that their fathers and grandfathers have done a farming system, which I'll point to a little bit later. And so, I want to show, as a journalist, my goal is to hold a mirror to the world and report back to my reader what I see. And so in that sense, I try to have these experiences and talk to as many people as I can, and have these local trips where I can do it, or international trips, or even desk reporting where I'm talking to people by Skype or by phone, just to understand how human activities affect the world and then what the natural world does back to us. And so going back to this, slide, this slide here, looking at this artisanal gold mining, we're doing this to the earth around us. And what's happening then is when there's a rainfall, much of this river is eroded away. The edges are eroded away. The river becomes filled with silt. You can't fish in it anymore, and it's filled with mercury. So whatever is caught in this area is really poisonous to the people who eat it. So so these systems are interconnected, and we're destroying our lands, and in many places where it doesn't need to be true. It doesn't need to be so. But there aren't other options for people, and so they're doing what they can do to survive. So the story of precision agriculture was in the publication Mongabay, which really tells stories of news on the environment internationally. And so much of my writing and current role is the National Geographic visiting professor of science communication at the School of Media and Public Affairs. I teach science reporting for students majoring and minoring in journalism, and I also teach science communication for students majoring in the STEM fields of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And so, I feel that it's really important for us to have a better knowledge of how journalists report science news, but also as scientists or engineers or technologists, I also feel that it's important to be able to communicate that work to people who may not necessarily interact with that kind of knowledge or be specialists in that kind of knowledge, whether it's the layperson or somebody else in a different field, or just the general public. So in my work, I intentionally use a lot of language that immediately brings together these visuals in people's minds, like a mosquito bite that itches, or that people might think about goldenrod and its pollen as food for wild bees, or how starchier pollen essentially has become junk food for bees. So these visuals in kind of the writing that I do, have nothing to do with the science, but it has a way of showing you the kind of the language that I use to draw people in to read my stories. And so I really attempt to convey these social and ecological concepts through writing these scenes. And so just going to pull my next slide up here. So, this is some of the writing that I do for, there's journals, globally, and is also based on some of the case studies in my book. But, when I wrote about how the mechanics that occupy this quarter-acre lot in the middle of Washington closed their business and abandoned the properties, the neighbors really had a lot to fear. They were thinking that the city couldn't do anything else with a small plot. And so they were able to get people to work together and create a community garden. And so, I look for these stories of hope, even though I'm covering a lot of other stories that may seem difficult and hard. But by having a balance of stories that I can present to the world, it does help to provide this clearer picture that it's not just hopeless, and that we have a lot of reason for hope and for the people who are working on it. Other stories here, writing around the next water cycle. I've written, around governance, water governance and ecology. I interviewed a water engineer who spoke to me about sort of these natural solutions. And he told me about, in New York City, for example, new plans for city orchards, and they're using these like 9,000 grassed bioswales, which resemble marshy depressions. And I think that they're using something like that in the southeast, and I'm not sure if they're using them in Savannah. You'll have to let me know. But some of these are like green sponges that help to soak up water and avoid kind of all this water runoff and pumping every time it storms. We're getting these torrential rainstorms and much harder and faster rains more than ever. So, as I report in these stories, I'm quite thoughtful about how we can get the reader to look at the story a little bit deeper. And so, as a writer in an interview, I just look for these moments when maybe the scientist can explain something in a way that doesn't sound as if it's been written in a textbook. And so their words and actions can become this scene, and where a person is doing something in his or her job that's conveying information. So this, in my opinion, is really a successful way to do it and get the reader to get to the end of my article or end of my book. So I'm always looking for these moments. And in this case, in this article I wrote for the New Republic called One Meal a Day, it was, I was writing about the environmental security and the environment for peace in the Lake Chad region. I mean, that's the overarching goal of this article, was to convey how important the natural world is for peace. But the focus on getting people's attention to that information was on this visual story around one meal a day. And this is around, so I wrote this essay just really about Lake Chad. If you're not familiar with it, it's one of the largest bodies of water in Africa, and how these thick reeds and vital wetlands around the basin of the lake provided just these vast freshwater reserves for fish, for these breeding grounds for fish, fertile soil for agriculture, and grasslands where farmers graze their animals. But with the rise of Boko Haram, and like 10,000 at that time Nigerians fled into the neighboring Cameroon. So in response, the Cameroon's government had banned farmers from using some brands of fertilizer, and with the depletion and the drying up over many years of Lake Chad, that area was no longer able to grow food. And then with the rise of conflict there, they couldn't fertilize their fields. And so because they were using the same ingredient as a homemade explosive. And so the government had ordered these, also that these food staples like corn or maize grow no higher than 3 feet. So they would cut them off because they didn't want the Boko Haram from hiding in the planted fields. So all of this resulted in vast starvation. And so when I went in to write the story, I knew where I needed to end up. I knew that I wanted people to read it and not look away from starving people in these camps. And so I wanted to get people to look at the plates of food, which really demonstrate what a family will eat in a day. And so I wrote, we often turn away from images of starving and hungry and from the skeletal profiles, hollowed out eyes that attest to the misery and suffering. And then I go on to write, these images do not ask us to look into their eyes and see ourselves. They ask us to look at the emptiness of their bowls and reflect on the fullness of our own. And so, and getting at that, I'm really trying to point the reader to put yourself into a situation where you might not have your own personal experience. And so it's evidence-based, but it's also this human story, the people involved in the situation. It's much more engaging to understand what kinds of decisions people are making in each region of the world, and understand, how what we do or the actions that we take may have some kind of interplay with that. So, as a reporter, I'm always curious. I follow a thought, and one of this was really bringing up my book. I'm going to read from this in a minute. When I first started reporting on the environment, I hadn't really thought about the food element, even though I grew up on a farm in southern Minnesota. Food has always sort of been key in my family. Although I didn't in a farm area, I wasn't on a farm. My grandparents had a farm. My mother grew up on a farm. And we would go out to the farm on weekends, the family farm, to help out the grandparents with chores. My parents had gardens out there, and I still have some land out there that my cousins farm. But I hadn't really connected it to climate change until I went back there a few years ago, just before writing my book. And I was talking to people about how the different, what's been changing out there, whether it's extreme heat where they'd have to bring cattle to market much sooner than they would actually do normally, just because the cattle couldn't survive the 110 degree plus heat for, I don't know, a week at a time, or very, very hot temperatures in these black fields that they had. So, as a curious person, I'm always thinking, well, what's really happening around the world? And so, I started writing about this and took a year just to get my head around it, and then another year to write it, and traveling to different places. And what struck me was the idea that I often hear the farmers, especially in the United States, really talk about how important they are to feeding the world. And then I realized as I traveled around the world that there was a great disconnect from what we're doing here in the US and what people are doing around the world. And so I'm going to read to you a little bit from my book, Hot, Hungry Planet. So how is the global food system meeting the demands of people right now? Of the more than 7 billion people in the world, about 1 in 6 go to bed hungry every night. This is not because we don't have food. This is not because we do not grow enough food. It is, for the most part, because about 1 billion people, or somewhat fewer, don't have the financial, institutional, or political means to get it. They're too poor. They're too disenfranchised. They're too disconnected from world affairs. So they're too disconnected from world affairs to exercise power to get this food. They are food insecure. Essentially, it's a problem of poverty and institutions, and not one of agronomy or land use or change or forests. But in the near and far future, a growing global population with changing tastes will add to food insecurity, putting additional pressure on this food system. More important than population increases is dietary change and the rising middle class. Yes, adding the 2 billion people to the planet during the next 2 to 3 decades is a big issue. It means a whopping 30% increase in the food demand. But consider this, the increasing wealth of the world, especially the 4 billion people who are now becoming part of the global middle class. That group will increase from 1.8 billion in 2009 to 3.2 billion in 2020, so this is a little bit dated, and 4.9 billion by 2030. So most of this growth will be in Asia. By 2030, people in China, Indonesia, Vietnam, and other Asian countries will constitute 66% of the global middle class population and account for 59% of the middle class consumption, compared to 28% and 23% in 2009. So that growth is a big part of the reason, we need to still consider thinking about how we produce our food is important in this world. And so, I went around the world looking at other places and what they're doing. I went to Colombia. In Colombia, I looked at people who are finding ways. So this is shade grown coffee. This is with plantain coverage. And they're also looking at sustainable food systems where they needed to be innovators in this area, because they're no longer able to grow coffee. And this is like the major coffee growing region. And this is actually down the road, not too far from where they have the National Museum of Coffee in Colombia. And so, I realized that we needed to think beyond the environment, our land and water and air, only as a source of inputs for the food system, and recognize that these global environmental changes that we're feeling can diminish yields, which is what's happened here, reduce the amount of food we produce, and affect how nutritious it is or how I produce it. So here they decided to modify and change part of their crop from, still doing some shade grown coffee and with the mixture of plantains. And then the other side, they're raising cattle, because they've got a strong history of cattle ranching there, but they're doing so on a small plot of land that's planted with shrubs. It's called agroforestry and silvopastoral grazing. And so, I started thinking about how this, experience of change can prompt people into action. And so here in Colombia, I talked to a number of people who are trying to work sustainably. And this is Fabiola Vega. So she was in this hilly northern region of the Northern Cauca Valley. Again, a big production area in Colombia. And she needed to find ways to increase her yields as the coffee production was decreasing. And so she, with the help of other family members, started raising a small herd of cattle. And the reason I'm pointing out to her as well is that women in this area don't particularly have a strong history of farming, but they've been given opportunity, especially as in post-conflict times in Colombia after the peace agreement, even though I want to be clear that there's still not peace in many areas of Colombia. I've been there 4 or 5 times, I think, since the peace agreement was signed. And actually this trip was maybe before that. But it's a way that women have been able to focus on finding resilience and livelihoods and getting actually more of their family members back to repatriate back to Colombia to have jobs, since others have fled to work in Spain and so on. And so, so I looked at ways in which farming and agriculture can serve not only to support food and to support environmental sustainability, but also peace. And by having this peaceful way of growing and planting crops has been a way to not only increase, physical security, but food security, and for women especially, developing skills as community leaders and adding value to their families. And so, this understanding that this foods, a food system like this is really one of the largest forces impacting our planet's environment and people's health. And so the choices about what crops are grown or where and how we grow it are really region by region. This happens to be, like I said, a very culturally significant cattle ranching area in Colombia. I mean, I would guess it's maybe similar to how we think of Texas or Kansas as a big cattle ranching area as well. And understanding how it's also the peace deal in Colombia for me has been an ongoing theme. I'm not going to get into it too much right here, but by planting the trees, this is, I'd go through the forest and see some of these trees. This one was maybe 5 years old, this tree. In another 10 years, or maybe, yeah, another 10 years, he'll be able to start to harvest some of these. And this is a farmer that will be able to sell this wood and put his kids through college. So, there's ways that the people are using agroforestry in addition to mixed types of farming to create more sustainable livelihoods for themselves, but also feed their planet and then add to biodiversity in their area. When I was in India, a really big piece of this was understanding how they are working to be climate smart in the face of climate change. And one of the ways is to understand for them how to adapt to these heavy rains that they're getting. So this was I was in Haryana as well as Punjab state and sort of north of Delhi. But I was talking to the farmers there, and they said they had experienced, like, in maybe 3 days, they experienced the entire monsoon season's worth of rain in 3 days. And so what they're finding is that they're having to plant new kinds of rice that they had planted before, but also understand how to plant their fields in ways where their water isn't going to completely submerge the crop for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and then nothing will grow. Because this is happening right at the time when the monsoons usually happen right at the time when they plant the field of rice. And so this is a farmer that I interviewed. He's pointing there to his patch of crops, rice crops, where the paddy has, historically, they would burn the wheat because they have a wheat and rice rotation. So they would burn the wheat crop off and then plant the rice after that. And so, trying to be a little more climate smart. First of all, it's illegal to burn the residue from the crops, the preceding crop, but they do it anyway. And you'll probably hear about it every year in November. Delhi is always smoke-filled and polluted, and that's because they're burning all of this this residue, crop residue. So they're looking for ways actually to keep and not till the land so that it can actually withstand and have more organic matter to be able to absorb and drain the fields more actively. And he was showing me here how he was telling me he stayed up for for a month when his crops were really submerged under a lot of water. He was so afraid that they would just be waterlogged and not grow. But here it did grow, even though he tried this new method. But I also show this picture with his son with him. I mean, the idea is that he was trying something new, and here he is. I think he was maybe 68 years old and had been farming for a long time and had lived through some terrible times of drought and food insecurity there, and some famines that killed a lot of people. And so for him to actually take a risk and make a big change like this was a big deal. But I'm also, in my book, I also write about the crop breeding. I think that, I want to talk a little bit about that as well. I think we have had this idea that we've got to, the idea is that we have to have GMOs to feed the world. Well, I think that, we do believe, and it's been sort of largely debated around a lot of sectors, including the big international and security agencies, as well as the food security agencies, that yes, we do need some GMO crops in this world to be able to deal with a lot of our food growth, including corn and soybeans, just because the vastness of it, the types of problems associated with it, but also, the kinds of harm that it takes and to be able to produce enough of a yield per acre of land. That's basically what we're looking at with some of the GMO crops, especially the corn that's used for feed and the soybean. So those are the primary crops that we have that are GMO. You know, there aren't that many vegetable crops that we have that we grow that are genetically modified that you'll find in the grocery store. But we are seeing, especially all the security people I've talked to and the people I've talked to regarding agriculture, is that you know, there are certain types of these, you know, soybean crops that are and corn crops that are, you know, that we're just not going to be able to grow them in a secure fashion to be able to continue our production levels and meet our demands of selling these crops for the kinds of production we need. So I guess, but on the flip side, you know, the food system is one of the largest forces, you know, affecting the environment. And so one of the challenges in achieving this more sustainable and fair food system is that corporate consolidation of the food sector. So that's the other argument against the understanding the GMO crops, is that you're considering that, you know, all the different mergers that have happened. I don't know if you've been following that, but there's the global giants, you know, Bayer, Monsanto, you know, the merger there, the DuPont Dow merger, and the Syngenta Chem China, you know, mergers. Like, these aren't agricultural companies first, they're chemical companies. And so understanding how that might have a cascade effect is something I would kind of be wanting to think about and understand in the future. I mean, what we know about global food security comes from supporting biodiversity. And so when we have just a handful of commodity crops like soybeans and corn dominating a large inland area, that's where we really see the issue, you know, the conflict there, because it's not supporting the biodiversity. But it is needed for being able to produce this vast amount of crops. And so the picture I'm pointing here on the screen is one of the rice breeders that I've talked to. She's done some really hopeful and amazing work there. So rice around the world is not something that is supported by the big corporations. It's usually pretty local, and if different regions have their favored kinds of rice. But one of the problems with rice is that it's having to be grown in different conditions, like this heavy floods. And you may have remembered a few years ago when, like, the soccer team was stuck underneath in a cave in, was it Thailand, where they were stuck for, you know, weeks or a while. They were thinking about being, you know, flooded for a long period of time. That was during the monsoon season. Well, they're actually, the reason I'm bringing that up is because they've actually been breeding crops that can withstand these long periods of flooding that that are types of rice that, using conventional breeding, they're able to breed kind of the kind of rice that will grow up through this long-standing water and still produce enough grain. And so at the end of when it finally does flood, it can actually still produce grain. There's another kind of rice that they're producing called snorkel rice. It can breathe underwater. It can be submerged normally it would die if it was submerged for 2 weeks, but this kind can kind of hold its breath underwater so that after these long rains, they can then still grow. And finally, this third kind, which I'm pointing to here, is a red rice. So the image on the right side is the red rice. It's the weedy form of rice. It's kind of like having crabgrass in your yard, where in the summer, your nice Bermuda grass is like kind of just mellowing out, but the crabgrass is going nuts. That's because the crabgrass is like, ooh, it's hot and it's, you know, I'm going to grow. And that's kind of what the weedy rice does here. But you can't harvest the seeds, but she is actually finding a way to crossbreed these, where we've got, during this hot and maybe wet time when other plants kind of take a break, this weedy rice that's been crossbred into with this other rice can still grow and produce good amounts of grain with it that's edible. So, you know, these are some of the solutions I focus on in my book, as well as looking at the local farmers. This is a farmer I met in Iowa. He is, you know, the value of buying local and supporting local people and local farmers couldn't be more important. Like I said, it's part of the biodiversity. It's part of also understanding this hope and urgency of how do we move the planet forward. You know, we've got this momentum right now that we're heading in maybe a right direction, where we must seize this opportunity. And, you know, like I said, these tipping points that we have of understanding what we can do. And as one of my colleagues, Frank Sesno, wrote recently in an op-ed he wrote, he reminded us of the Barack Obama ticking clock dictum, where he said, like, we're the first generation to feel the effect of climate change and the last generation to actually do something about it. And so I've been working a lot with my students on this. We have had this Planet Forward Summit, which we bring big major voices, including the new head of the EPA, who's actually, full disclosure, I think he got his graduate degree from George Washington University. But, he spoke with our students at the Planet Forward Summit we had recently. And, understanding how for decades, there's been a lot of people that have been left out of this discussion around climate change and the environment, and how, for decades, the Black people, Indigenous, Latinx, and other people of color have been disproportionately borne the highest burdens of climate change and environment, and, I guess, hot cities, as well as pollution. And so, this is not really a time for this political, polarized ideology to, I guess, come together. But it's a time for us to understand that so many people are being affected in so many different ways that we are at a time where we really have to start taking action. And I, oops, I think see if I can go back here. I have one slide I think I went over. This is, one of the things that I just wanted to really bring up and close out before, and I realize I'm running out of time. I went way over what I expected to talk about today, so I apologize on that. But, one of the things that I feel is really important is really understanding that, we have this need to be able to do our best to be the stewards of the planet, our best stewards of the planet that we can be. And, this is a quote from Chief Seattle, that if you can read it here. I think he was a big man, and I think that his voice, understanding, it may just be legend. I don't know if he actually said this, but this is what I've been told, is that, he felt that we have this compassion for people around us, and that, things are changing, they will always be changing, but let's try to make a way for us to continue to be the best stewards of the planet that we can be. So with that, I am going to end my presentation, and I can figure out how I can stop sharing this. I can take questions. So thanks very much, everybody, for sticking with me, and for bringing your questions. So,
thank you very much, Lisa. We have several questions, and I think we should just get right into them. It was a stimulating talk, but let's our audience wants to hear your answers to some of these questions. Let me start with one that was sent in when registration. We've got a couple of those. How essential are planting trees in the overall efforts to limit climate change and support the environment?
Yeah, that's a great question. In fact, I have an article that will be coming out in a couple of weeks, or maybe next month sometime. I'm not sure exactly. But trees are one of the world's most cost-effective carbon sinks, and we've had business and political leaders putting these big tree planting programs together. It's a really unifying solution for carbon emissions. Everybody's behind the planting the tree, but the scientists who study trees and reforestation and carbon cycling and biodiversity in forests, they said that this, looking at it solely as this nature-based climate solution, it drives them to have some concern, because reducing these risks from climate change will require vastly more than planting trees or tree cover and forest protections. It kind of underpins the risks and challenges of focusing only on trees for their carbon benefits. I know that they're also looking at ways that we can plant trees for a lot more, like agroforestry, what other kinds of things we can grow and harvest from the tree planting. So there's been, like in 2020, the World Economic Forum had the launch of the Trillion Trees campaign, and then there's a 1t.org. And then the U.S. also, the last administration had the 1 Trillion Trees Interagency Council and other sort of existing international initiatives like the Bond Challenge and the IUCN, the International Union of Conservation of Nature. So there's been a lot of activity around this. So yes, it's really important, but also not to just like only rely on that as the nature-based solution. I think that having trees as part of it is important, but we also know that we don't have enough tree stock or like the infrastructure to plant all those trees. So, I think the scientists that I talk to, that I've been talking to about that, think that this, having this reliance on trees as a prominent climate mitigation strategy, that focus has been maybe disproportionately too high. Also because just understanding how trees grow, it takes at least 10 years of full growth before they actually start to absorb carbon. So there's been, just in the carbon cycle. So that's something important to know about that. So it's a kind of a long explanation, but good question.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Now, we have a question again in registration from Fred Langley. Are GMOs and precision farming essential to feeding growing populations around the globe? Yeah,
actually, another really good question. So the GMO, like I said, it's really worrisome is regarding these big multinational companies that are focused on this handful of commodity crops. But we do know that global food security is important. That we do need to have these crops to be successful. And there's the GMOs that they're using for the corn and soybeans is important for their growth. It actually helps them not have to put so many other chemicals on the plant. So yes, that is required. It's also that precision agriculture is a really important concept because they've been finding much better ways to plant and speaking with my colleagues, especially at the University of Minnesota, are studying this. They're planting the rows a little closer together, especially in the US, and they're having more precision application of fertilizer. That's the precision agriculture part of it. That makes it an important. I think what's not happening enough though is the crop rotations that they used to have. So they're depleting the soil very much so in terms of the phosphorus. But they're not, because they used to, I don't know how familiar you are, but they used to just every year when I was growing up, if one year it was corn, the next year it was soybeans, but now they're planting corn on corn on corn on corn because they can get these higher price levels for them. And the land is so valuable now.
Great, thank you for that answer. We have 3 questions that are kind of related, so I'm going to put them all together with respect to the people that asked them. The one was a broad overall question, and the second 2 are more specific. So let me do that. What can we do with respect to our own food and agriculture choices to help the environment? And then Olavi Ahrens writes, what should a community like Savannah be doing? Do you have any specific ideas? And then another member, Joan Wade, writes, what can I do as an individual American now? So all 3 of those, I think, are asking the same thing. What can we do?
Yeah, and that's so important because we all want to know what we can do, right? Because we want to be part of the solution. I think overall, the first thing is I always say, and hear me out here, but I say buy less food and eat all of it. Meaning we often, especially when I had family, I would just buy food because I didn't want to be out of food for my family. And then maybe a Thursday night, the kids would run late with soccer practice or whatever, and we'd get dinner out, and then there would be whatever it would be going to waste in the refrigerator. I have to toss it. So that being said, food waste is a huge problem in our country. Even the littlest thing, my kids joke at me because sometimes if I don't eat a half a piece of toast, I will put it in a Ziploc baggie or put it some foil over it, and I'll eat it later. And so that's kind of what's important here is like buying less food, understanding what it takes to grow food is also very useful. So getting to know a local farmer, supporting your local farmers, buying diverse items from them, buying from their crop share. That's something I would do locally from Savannah. If you are local, can you be a part of a community garden? That's an amazing way to meet your neighbor, meet more people, learn new kind of skills. A lot of community gardens aren't just doing their own individual plots, but you're gardening together in kind of a group thing, because you can get economies of scale there. And so I've seen that happen, as well as it's a connectivity node for meeting people that you might not normally come to know. One of my colleagues at American University is, she does culinary, oh gosh, what does she call it? Gastronomic diplomacy or something like that, conflict cuisine. But what she does is really interesting. And her name is Joanna Mendelsohn Foreman. You may know her work, but what I found, and maybe you can find out and report back to me, I'll do a story on it, or be of interest, is to find out what maybe some immigrant communities in your area have community gardens in the garden and what they're planting, because we're only one meal away from our home food. You know, like it takes that one meal to remind us of home. And so can they plant, are they planting something that reminds them of home and cooking there, or finding a way to be able to know how to grow a Southern food like okra, maybe for the first time. And that's at the community garden, where you're developing more of a community, but also world connection. So that's what I would say if I were in Savannah.
Great.
That's what I would be doing.
Some of our members do participate in a community garden called the Skidaway Farms, and right on our island here. So when you come and visit us, we'll give you a tour.
Oh, great. And I will. I'll take you up on that for sure. It's one of my favorite things. I'm actually writing a book about gardens. That's my next book. So.
Okay, well, great. We have a few minutes left to take further questions, so I remind people to use their Q&A button on the Zoom screen, type it in. And we have another question while you're typing in your questions. We have one more here that Jim Van Epp sent in. Do you have evidence, Lisa, that your urgent messages that you've been reporting today are reaching important audiences that can change current bad practices?
You know, yes, actually, yes. And I wrote the book because I wanted to have a seat at the table. And so, and I've been having that seat at the table with the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, with roundtables. I've been getting lots of meetings through the State Department, Office of Global Food Security. You know, I wrote the book so I could have a seat at the table and bring this voice up there, and it's worked, and it's been useful. And so in that sense, we're finding more and more of our leaders interested in this. It's an area as well. There's been a lot of work done by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs on this to support this effort. But there's been a lot of evidence as well that this is a bipartisan issue that people can come together on. And so it's always been something that we're looking at ways to be more sustainable. And even corporations are you know, they need to make sure that their next crop will be there, especially the soybean crops planted in Brazil that are you know, commodity traded. There are now ways that they are tracing that to make sure that they're not as a result of deforestation. They're making sure that they're not as a result of conflict or some other, you know, taking water where it shouldn't be, or using more water resources than it's available to them. And that's through something called the trace. And so there's been ways now for these big organizations, Unilever, you know, the big commodity organizations who buy these commodity crops from places like Brazil, having a way to be able to find the traceability for their sustainability of those crops. So yes, I'm finding that it's becoming more, it's more part of the conversation than ever before.
Great. Well, thank you very much. We've reached the hour.
Okay.
Went very fast. Thank you very much for your enthusiastic, as you said at the beginning, enthusiastic and inspiring effort, talks. It was very good. And I think you've inspired us to go look at your book, which I think is very interesting. For those of us who haven't traveled much in the last year, it's also a wonderful way of catching up with parts of the world that we'd love to go to, Africa, South America, and so forth. So it's very, very well written. And again, thank you for joining us tonight. And I hope you will consider coming to Savannah in the near future in person. when we get back to
Yes.
live sessions.
Thank you very much. I'd be honored, and I really am honored to be here as a part of your group tonight. Thank you so much. And I put out in my initial slide my website and my Twitter handle, and feel free to reach out to me. Chip, you're welcome to share my email address as well if any other members need or want to have any further conversations. So thank you.
Terrific. And this presentation will be on our YouTube channel for those who would like to go back and get that information or look at any of the materials that Lisa presented in greater detail. So before we sign off, I'm going to bring up one more slide, I hope, as we normally do. All right, so this is our next session. It is and last session for the season, Thursday, May 20th, almost a month from now at 7 p.m. again. It is Out of the Shadows: How Intelligence Lessons from the War on Terror can help fight U.S. domestic terrorism. Margaret Coker is managing editor of The Current, which is a new paper, a new internet independent journalistic effort in Savannah. And she is the former Baghdad bureau chief of New York Times. So I think people are going to find this very interesting, and I hope you will tune in next month. So with that, I would say stay safe. Thank Lisa again, and we'll see you at our next presentation on May 20th. Good night from Savannah. Bye-bye.
Thank you.